Whale, whale, whale. It's the first Friday of April, guys. You know what that means?
What does it mean? What does it mean?
It means it's Facebook Live time here at the aquarium. And we are going to be talking about a fantastic topic. We're going to be talking about whales. So, whales are local residents in this area that we often forget about during the winter time for a combination of reasons. A lot of them actually leave this area, although not all of them. And also the conditions are just harder for humans to go out on boats and actually look for them as well. Many leave this area and go to warmer places where they might calve and raise their young. But the springtime, right around this time of year, starts to bring nutrients into our local waters, which kickstarts the food chain, and that brings a lot of animals back to this area, including whales. So, this also marks the beginning of Boston Harbor Cruises whale watch season, which is exciting. And that's why we're outside here on the harbor walk behind the aquarium. We also have a special guest with us today, Taylor, don't we?
Yeah. We sure do.
Her name is Lorna Blocksma, and she is a naturalist on the whale watch boats, right, Lorna?
I am very happy to be here with you guys.
Thanks for coming, Lorna.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so we're going to start out by getting Lorna right into the action here, Taylor.
Yeah, so as a whale watch naturalist, Lorna is very familiar with some of the animals that you see. So first and foremost, Lorna, what species of whale do you typically see if you were to go on a whale watch here?
So when we're on the whale watch boats, we're looking for a lot of different species, but usually the one that we're looking out for most is our humpback whales, which is my personal favorite whale around here. For anyone who knows me, you might know that I like whales just a little bit.
A touch.
So this season starting is very, very exciting. So when you go out on the boats, we a lot of times, like I said, we're looking for those humpback whales specifically. However, we also see a lot of other species when we're out there. So it's not just humpbacks that we have. We actually have an enormous amount of minke whales, which are a smaller type of whale. When I say smaller, it's still about 25 feet in length. So it's still a really good sized whale. We also have fin whales, which are actually the second largest animal on the planet. And we see those out there quite often as well. So fin whales are really, really big whales. So we see fin whales too. And then we also have a couple of other species that we see every once in a while. If we're lucky, sometimes we get a faraway look at some right whales. Those are a little bit of a tease because if we do see right whales at the beginning of our season, we actually point those out to people and then go the opposite direction because they have a lot of protections on them for good reason. They're one of the most endangered whale species on the entire planet. So North Atlantic right whales are really cool to see from a really far distance. But those are the main ones that we're seeing when we're out there.
Okay, yeah, and hopefully if oh, go ahead, Taylor.
What other animals might you see out on a whale watch beyond whales?
Beyond whales. So I know I get very whale focused, but we do see a lot of other things on the boat. So we also see a lot of seals, actually. We have gray seals out here. We have harbor seals out here. So seals are something that we keep our eyes out for. And then we also keep our eyes out for sharks. So we have a great many shark species out here. You do have to get really lucky. Sharks are something that we always wish we could see, but it has to be pretty flat, calm out on the water because all you're looking for is that one fin kind of gliding through. Last year, we actually got incredibly lucky. Multiple times on the whale watch boats, passengers actually spotted a great white shark, which is not something that you see often out on the boats. We had to stress so much that this is a really special experience. Some people don't believe you when you say things like, we don't see this every day, but we really don't see great white sharks that much. We also have some blue sharks out there, and basking sharks are a really, really cool one to see as well. And then one of the other things we see typically during the summer is going to be the largest bony fish, which is a mola mola, or around here is very famous for being a baby whale. So.
You had to bring that up.
Yeah. If you haven't seen the video, look it up. All right. At this point, I think we'll turn it back over to Nick. Nick, can you maybe tell us a little bit about how whales fit into our local ecosystem here?
Absolutely, sure. So whales are typically very large creatures, like we've been talking about here, and they have a really important role in our local ecosystem. They help to balance the food web out in a lot of different ways. So number one, they are, like I said, it's sort of at the top of the food chain. They're not always feeding on large animals. In fact, most whales are feeding on smaller animals. And a cool fact for you guys that you may not have known, there are generally two different types of whales when it comes to thinking about their teeth. There are toothed whales that have teeth similar to human beings. And there are also baleen whales, which basically have teeth that are made of these tiny little fibers, which are made of the same things that we have in our hair and in our fingernails, those of us that have hair. They use those to filter feed. And so they basically are feeding on populations of animals and controlling those populations of animals. For the baleen whales, often very small things like plankton, very small shrimp. For the toothed whales, bigger species, but they're sort of keeping a control on the populations of animals below them. And then another really important role that whales play in local ecosystems is their poop.
Whale poop.
Lorna, what would you say that a whale's poop is referred to as?
So when we see whales poop out on the whale watch boat, it's referred to as a plume. And we get really excited about a nice plume when we see it. So it's super important for the ecosystem. Well, I'll let you tell everyone why. But yes, we do love to point that out to people when we see it on the boats, because it always gets a good laugh, but it is actually really important for the ecosystem.
Yeah, when it comes to poop, we often think of just really gross things, but actually poop contains nutrients that can serve to fertilize the ecosystem. And so actually whale poop will spur the growth of things like phytoplankton that they actually eat. So by pooping, they're helping to create food for themselves, which is really wild to think about. But they're not just spurring things that they eat, they're also spurring the growth of other organisms that fit into the food chain in some other ways. So whale poop is really, really important. Another thing that happens when it comes to whales that's a little bit sad to think about is when a whale passes away, their carcass will often fall to the bottom of the ocean. We refer to this as a whale fall, just like it sounds. But when that big-bodied animal falls to the bottom, it actually ends up creating a sort of a mini ecosystem for deep ocean animals to feed on and seek nutrients. And often there are animals that don't get a chance to feed for weeks and months at a time. And when a whale carcass comes down, they basically get their food allotted for like an extended period of time. So
all you can eat buffet.
Right? It's kind of amazing. Yeah. So it actually performs a really important function. And sort of those whales end up putting their energy sort of back into the ecosystem, although in a very different part of the ocean from where they normally spend most of their time. Okay, so the next thing I think we're going to talk about is how whales sort of connect locally here in New England. Is that right, Taylor?
Yeah, we're going to talk about humans and whales. So humans and whales, their relationship today is a little bit different than what it has been historically. In fact, whales and humans have a somewhat complicated relationship historically, in that humans have hunted whales in the past. And actually, hunting whales was really important for local economies and local communities, and in many cases helped these communities grow and thrive. And it's actually part of the reason that New England became such a thriving metropolis, is in part due to whaling. And you can still see a lot of kind of that history in local communities here. Unfortunately, we also realized that hunting whales for their meat and their blubber and their oil is not a super sustainable practice, and so we have stopped whaling here in New England and in the United States because whales are slow to grow, they're slow to reproduce, and if you take too many of them out of the ecosystem, it can have really long-term effects. And we are still seeing the effects of whaling, even though we think of whaling as this thing that happened a really long time ago, we're still seeing the impact of that on local whale species. I think the North Atlantic right whale is one that it pretty hits home with this one. Right whales are actually get the name right whale because they were considered the right whale to hunt for. They have a pretty high blubber content, which means you get a lot of that blubber, a lot of that oil. They also swim pretty high in the water column. They're kind of slow moving.
Really slow moving.
They're not the smartest of the whales. Sorry, right whales. And they also hang out really close to shore, which means you don't have to go far to get them. They're easy to spot, and they're easy to catch. So right whales were the right whale to catch, and because that their populations really took a hard hit due to whaling, and we're still seeing that specific species try to rebound from the extensive whaling that happened, you know, many, many years ago at this point. So that being said, Lorna, what are some challenges that whales, not just right whales, but whales in general, are facing today?
Yeah, so whales today, like you said, they have a complicated relationship with humans. So the two biggest threats to whales today are going to be entanglement and ship strike.
Okay.
So those are the two ones that are really affecting populations. You mentioned the North Atlantic right whale, and we keep saying it's one of the most rare whales in the entire world. And to give you an idea of just how rare they are, there is, I think the last count had them right around 411 total. Not just here, but total. So 411. That is, you know, as you can probably think, that's not a lot. And this year they did have 7 calves that they did spot. So they do those really cool aerial surveys where they go over and they look for those whales. So right whales, although we don't hunt them anymore, they are very protected animals. They do unfortunately still move really slowly. They have not evolved to move any faster. So what that means is they are still getting hit by boats. So they do frequently, you know, move really slowly right at the top of the water column as they're feeding. So they open their mouth. Nick mentioned they're one of those that have baleen, so they're filter feeders. So they just have their mouth kind of skimming the surface, which means they are really easily hit by boats because they're right there at the surface. And those really large boats, those giant cargo ships, even if they pull their brakes, it takes them almost a full mile to come to a complete stop. So unfortunately, even if they see a whale, it doesn't always mean they can avoid it. And entanglement, like I said, is the second one. So with entanglement, they very frequently are coming in contact with things like fishing gear or just loose gear that gets lost out in the ocean, nets, things like that.
We have a question.
Oh yeah.
Where do whales go when they're not here in New England?
Great question.
So whales, when they're not here, it really depends on the species. So we can't say in a general sense where it is that they go. So in the beginning of the season, I mentioned that right whales, as we're talking about them, we see them sometimes in the very early season for us. So late April and early to mid-May, we're on the lookout for those right whales when we're out there. And those right whales are kind of making their way north. So they're going towards Canada. Usually the Bay of Fundy is where they're headed, and they do a lot of feeding there. And then in spring, unfortunately, or not spring, but towards the summer time, we don't exactly know where it is that they go. It's not something that's been well documented. They kind of just disappear for a little while, and then they reappear down south. So we think they go pretty far offshore. For humpback whales are much better studied because they're easier to study. And our population of humpback whales right here in the Gulf of Maine is about 900 strong. We know them very well. They actually, almost all of them have names. And those whales are going to spend their summer months up here with us feeding. And then they are going to migrate down to, a lot of them basically off the coast of the Dominican Republic, to a place called Silver Bank. So a lot of them go to that one certain place. Obviously they can go different places, but most of the humpback whales are going to go right off the coast of Silver Bank. Minke whales, once again, they are not a very well studied species. We kind of think they're probably here throughout the year, but we don't really know for sure.
I think
can I just say that I would like to migrate in the winter?
you want to migrate to the Dominican Republic
Yeah.
in the winter.
That sounds
I
lovely.
could get on board with that.
Humpback whales
too.
have
Yeah.
kind of a summer home and a winter home. It's a nice deal they got
I
going
like
on.
that.
Snowbirds. So I think at this point we've talked a little bit about local species, things that we're seeing here, some of the challenges that they've been facing. So maybe let's talk a little bit about what the New England Aquarium is doing to help protect our local species of whales.
And that's really important, you know, when we think about issues affecting animals like whales and other things affecting our ocean. Sometimes you can get a little down thinking about these big problems, but we really want to focus on the solutions because there are plenty of things that we can do. And like Taylor was hinting on, we want to set a good example here at the aquarium. And so, thankfully, we have a lot of great people that are working hard to help whales out. And that starts with our Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life here at the aquarium, where we have a lot of amazing scientists and researchers that have been studying whales for decades, and really some of the foremost experts on particular species of whales, including the North Atlantic right whales here in this area. So one of the first things I want to talk about has to do with what Lorna was hinting on about how you can track whales using visual surveys. Sometimes that involves flying in a plane and tracking their distributions. Sometimes that involves just getting on a boat and tracking them as well. And so our team does that quite a bit as well, and that's really important because that has helped to inform regulations that relate to things like shipping lanes and fishing gear as well. So just by studying where those animals are, where they're spending their time, where they go, and Lorna did hint on the fact that that whole puzzle hasn't been completely filled in yet for every species, but when they are up in this area, we're able to spend some time looking after them and tracking them, and that's helping us to inform a lot of those great regulations as well. And there are lots of other things that we've studied them for too, particularly the North Atlantic right whales. Studying their habitat, where they spend their time, has helped us to kind of connect the pieces in terms of what they eat and also how they might be impacted by other things such as climate change, which, as we've talked about in earlier Facebook Lives, right, Taylor?
Just a couple times, once or twice.
Right? Is warming the Gulf of Maine faster than anywhere else in the world? Maybe having an impact on the animals that North Atlantic right whales like to eat. It may be driving those populations further away from where the whales typically like to feed, and so that's going to obviously impact where those whales spend their time. So we've also been doing research on those kinds of things as well, too. I think Taylor wants to hit on one particular item that relates back to the plumes that we were talking about earlier.
I think we may have a question from the audience.
Oh, okay.
First. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does the aquarium work with local people, fishermen or otherwise, that might be impacted by whales and the regulations that protect them?
Great question.
That's a great question.
We were going to talk about this in a minute, but we'll just go ahead and jump right into it.
Yeah.
So we do, in fact, consult with local fishermen, and actually local fishermen understand the importance of these whales. You know, whales are these big, charismatic megafauna, so fortunately for whales, people typically do care a lot about them, and so one of the things that we do is we consult with policymakers and local fishermen on the best way to protect them. And so one of the things that Lorna mentioned that they were facing was entanglement. So entanglement is really hard for whales. Basically what happens is that gear gets wrapped around their body, and then they're dragging sometimes hundreds of pounds of fishing gear behind their body. If you had to think about that, that would be like you wearing a harness with a parachute on the back and having that parachute drag behind you in every move you make throughout the entire day. You can imagine, not only is it exhausting, but it takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of energy. So sometimes they're not eating enough to kind of combat just the drag on their body, which can have implications for things like having babies. Those females need a pretty healthy body weight in order to be able to have offspring, and so we're kind of seeing some of these trickle-down effects right now, and it's some of the things that we're studying. One of the projects that we're working on is actually ropeless fishing gear, which is really cool, actually. So basically, the lines that whales are often getting entangled in are the buoy line. So the line that goes from the fishing gear up to the surface that lets fishermen know, hey, that's my gear, I know where to go to find it. This is the one that's a little trickier to eliminate. We've already worked on sink rope or neutrally buoyant rope, which essentially the gear that is all connected, that rope sinks to the bottom, but we still have this buoy line. So what scientists would like to do is to create technology that actually allows that rope to be pulled down to the bottom of the ocean floor while the gear is soaking. And then once the fishermen come back, using probably some GPS location, but also just some physical tracking technology, they will be able to initiate that buoy to come back up to the surface. They're trying out a couple different ways to do that at this point, which is pretty cool. But we actually just helped a grant come through that would help fund some of this ropeless fishing gear, because I think that's one of the big challenges, and we recognize that, is that switching out fishing gear is expensive. And that is usually the big hang up. It's not that fishermen don't want to do these things, it's that they just can't fund it. It's not sustainable for them to be able to switch all of their gear on a regular basis. So if we can work with funders and help the fishermen get this funding, then we can kind of help this technology come to fruition, and hopefully then it becomes more popular and then more affordable for the fishermen in the future. So there are some things that we are doing, we're working on here, and kind of using our knowledge from the research that we've done in order to help local people who already are wanting to help whales and just maybe need to know the best way to do that, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I'll also add in that when we are on the whale watch boats, one of the things that we are really careful to watch out for is any whales that are actually entangled in gear. So if we ever see ropes of any kind or anything that we might think means they're entangled, we actually call the hotline for entangled whales. and that is connected to Center for Coastal Studies. So if you are actually ever out on a boat anywhere, so if you're out fishing yourself or anything like that, if you do ever see a whale, because very frequently they'll go right past fishing boats, so if you're ever out there during the summer, there's a lot of boats out on the water, and you ever see something that you're not completely sure about, a lot of times it is brighter colors, so it's, you know, these blue lines or these white ropes contrasting their body. It's usually easy to see. Sometimes we don't see it until afterwards, unfortunately. When we take pictures for our data collection, we'll go back, and sometimes if you zoom in, you can see, unfortunately, monofilament fishing line, which is really thin and clear, and then we can call them afterwards, because like I said, we do know them by the undersides of their tails, so we can communicate to Center for Coastal Studies exactly which whale we think is entangled, and then they can kind of keep an eye out for it over the course of the next few weeks. So they do an incredible job, these people who go out and try and disentangle whales. They go out on these little boats and they do everything they can to take the gear off of these whales. So Center for Coastal Studies does amazing work with them, and it's actually, when we collect data on the boats, we do collect as much data as we can when we're out there, observational data, and we send all of our data to Center for Coastal Studies, which has one of the longest running humpback whale studies in the entire world.
Cool.
Wow. Yeah.
What can everyday people do to help whales in the area?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? Because we want to all get involved with these solutions to address these problems, right? So maybe we'll tag team this one all together, guys. I would say that looking into regulations that might impact the safety of whales and voting with that in mind is always a great way to support the protection of animals like whales. Just coming and taking a whale watch boat, actually, a lot of that money goes towards the funding of conservation efforts that are protecting the areas where those animals spend their time, or other efforts that are being done. So, yeah. Any other ideas, guys? Any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, like I said, if you're out on a boat yourself, as you can probably hear, there are boats going in and out of the harbor, so that background noise that you're hearing is actually boats moving in and out. But if you, as I already said, if you're on a boat yourself and you ever do see a whale that you think might be entangled, once again, calling that hotline, which you can very easily find online, is a great thing to do. And then, as Nick mentioned, supporting those local conservation efforts is really important. So not only the conservation efforts that Anderson Cabot is doing, but as I mentioned, the Center for Coastal Studies does amazing work as well. Taylor?
I think the one last thing that is something that we kind of touched on a little bit in our last Facebook Live is plastic. So we talk about plastic in the ocean all the time. I know, but it is actually a really big problem even for these really big animals. So Nick talked a little bit about filter feeding and the method that whales use in order to pull food out of the water. That balene's not super selective, so anything that's big enough to get stuck in that baleen is going to end up in that whale's stomach, and we've actually seen whales perish from hundreds of pounds of plastic inside of their bodies. So I think another really easy thing that people can do is try to avoid some of those single-use plastics, which will hopefully help avoid plastics ending up in the ocean and impacting really small things all the way up to the biggest animals in the ocean, those whales.
Way to call back to a former Facebook Live.
See what I did there? Yeah.
Nice work. Yeah.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions out there from the audience today? This is great. Keep them coming, guys.
Does the aquarium provide care for marine life, even if they aren't whales? And if you do you release them back into the ocean?
Ooh.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the aquarium does provide care for animals that are not essentially just in our building. So there's actually a stranding hotline connected to the aquarium here. So if you are out on a beach or you're out anywhere around here and you happen to see maybe a seal or a sea turtle or things like that, and it's not really looking that great, although we do have seals and they naturally haul out of the water and kind of hang out on the beach. Sometimes they do find them and they are actively entangled in some gear, once again going back to that entanglement. So that stranding hotline for us is really important, because then when you call the stranding hotline, someone will get that message, someone will always listen to that message or answer your call directly, and then they can decide what it is that we can or can't do for that animal. And if it's not in our zone, IFA usually takes care of, they're a rescue, stranding rescue as well, and they take care of the Cape. So right around the arm of the Cape, if you live around that area, IFA is they have a stranding hotline as well. And recently they have just been inundated with calls. There have been dolphins kind of stranding, unfortunately, all over the place. Seals, I think just last week the aquarium actually went out and disentangled a seal that had some fishing gear actually wrapped around its neck. Yeah. And then sea turtles too.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh,
Right.
I'm bringing the biggest
Yeah,
thing.
the biggest one for us.
Yeah,
Sure.
we take care of cold stun sea turtles, so occasionally sea turtles stay up here a little bit too long due to the geography of Cape Cod, that hook, the arm of the Cape. Sea turtles have a hard time navigating around it occasionally, so when the water temperature drops, as ectothermic animals, their body temperature also drops, and so we go out and we look for stranded sea turtles, we bring them inside, we rehabilitate them, and once they're healthy, we do release. If we are taking care of an animal that we want to release, we have to care for it in a really specific way. We don't want to expose them to germs that they might not be exposed to in the wild, or get too used to human interaction, because that can lead to other challenges down the road. So we do occasionally take care of animals that are going to go back to the ocean, and we also sometimes take care of animals that came from the wild that cannot go back to the ocean. Our fur seals are a really good example of this. A lot of our fur seals were wild seals that were either abandoned as pups for whatever reason, or had other health challenges that made it impossible for us to release them. So they're going to hang out here with us at the aquarium for the rest of their life, but they got a pretty good deal here, you know. It's free room and board, lots of good food to eat, and lots of doctors and aquarists to take care of them. It's a pretty good life. So we do in fact take care of animals kind of in both capacities. Great question.
And we got one more question from
Awesome.
Adrian, age 5, wants to know,
Yes.
why are blue whales so big?
Oh, such a good question, Adrian.
That's
Such
a really good
question. Yeah. Why are blue whales so big? Well, man, you know, I could spend hours here talking about evolution and all the different sizes of animals and how that all fits together. But you know what, I think the gist of what can answer your question, Adrian, is just that the Earth has room for animals of all different shapes and sizes and colors, and so some of them just end up being really, really big and sort of fit into the food web well that way. Some of them end up being really, really small. We could spend another hour or 2 hours talking about whales, and during that time you would hear from Gloria and Taylor and myself about all the different sizes of whales. There are some that are as big as blue whales, but there also are some that are quite small as well. And so there must have just been room in sort of the way that things all fit together for an animal as big as a blue whale, and they've been around in the ocean for a long time for sure. And just to give perspective for anyone that doesn't know, blue whales can be about the size of a school bus, up to 100 feet, maybe even a little bit more than that. They're thought to be the biggest animal, essentially the biggest animal on the planet. So yeah, they're a very special animal.
Yeah, I have gotten asked this question, I think once or twice before on the boats, and it has involved a lot of talk with all of my coworkers, because we have asked the same question. That's why it's such a great question, is because there's not just one single answer to that question. And I think Nick kind of nailed it on the head when it boils down to because they can. There was room, there is room for them to be that big. They fit into this wonderful ocean niche of being this huge, huge animal that feeds on the smallest thing in the ocean, which is
Wow.
also the most amazing part of blue whales, is their entire body, that 100-foot body, is fueled by these tiny, tiny animals, which just adds to how cool they are.
I think maybe just to wrap it up here today, I'm going to ask one last question of you, Lorna, and it's a question that we get a lot. Why don't we have whales in aquariums? You know, we do have some smaller species of whales. We have beluga whales, and we have some orca whales, things like that in zoos and aquariums. Hey, whale watch! That's
You hear
the
that,
whale
folks?
watch!
That's
It's
the
going
whale
on.
watch. We weren't kidding.
It is right here.
But why don't we have big whales in aquariums?
So that is a great question. It once again boils down to a pretty easy answer, which essentially is there's not room for them. And they are also, it kind of circles back. We have this conversation, I think, about sharks a lot of times too, is people want to know about those really big shark species. Pretty similar with whales. There's just not enough room to keep those larger whale species, and also they are migratory, so they are constantly moving. So even if there was enough room for them, those animals are used to moving back and forth from different areas. They swim thousands and thousands of miles. So like I said, you know, the whales we have here, the humpback whales specifically, we know they're going all the way down to the Dominican Republic. Some go way farther than that. On the other side, they have populations that go from Alaska to Hawaii. Some go from Hawaii to Antarctica. So there's just, they are so used to those really, really long swims. So those toothed whales are a little bit smaller. You're going to find some of those species in aquariums, but I don't think that there is actually any aquarium that has baleen whales. So once again, those whales that do not actually have teeth.
Awesome.
There you go.
So there you have it, right from the whale expert. Well, thank you, friends, for joining us for another First Friday Facebook Live.